My name is Thomas Hale. I'm 56 years old now, a detective by trade, and this is my story. What you're hearing happened decades ago, back when I was still young enough to believe family loyalty was guaranteed just by blood. I've carried this with me for most of my life, and time hasn't softened it. If anything, it's made every detail sharper. 3 weeks after my parents died, my older brother threw me out of the house. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He just looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Dad decided this a long time ago. Sons inherit everything. The rest of you get nothing. That's how it's always been in this family, and that's how it's going to stay." Then he changed the locks. That house was where I grew up. The place where I learned to ride a bike on cracked concrete and scraped my knees until my mother wrapped them in gauze. The place where I spent 2 full years caring for our dying mother, while my brother showed up exactly 3 times. 3. Each visit short, rehearsed, and hollow. It was the house where I sat beside her during chemotherapy, holding her hand while she fought nausea and fear, while he checked his expensive watch and complained about traffic on the highway. It was the house where I learned how quiet suffering could be. He tossed my belongings onto the front lawn like garbage bags and told me I was a burden. And in my father's world, that's all I ever was. What my brother didn't know, what none of us fully understood back then, was that my mother had been preparing for that exact moment for 8 years. 8 years of quiet planning. 8 years of private meetings with lawyers. 8 years of building something he believed he controlled, but never actually touched. Before I tell you what happened when the will was finally read, you need to understand the family I came from. The Hale family ran on one unshakable belief. My father, Raymond Hale, built his entire life around it. Sons carried the name forward. Sons mattered. Everyone else existed in the background. He wasn't loud about it. He wasn't cruel in obvious ways. He simply gave his time, his money, and his approval where he believed it belonged. He was a contractor successful enough to buy a 4-bedroom colonial in a quiet Connecticut suburb. Good schools, clean streets, a garage workshop filled with tools, where he spent his weekends teaching my brother how to build, fix, and profit, while I helped my mother in the kitchen without question. My mother, Margaret, was the steady center of our home. She kept a lavender garden in the backyard and tended it every morning like a promise to herself. She had a way of smoothing my father's rough edges, of translating his indifference into something easier to live with. When I was young, I believed her excuses. I thought that was just how families worked. My brother Andrew was 6 years older than me. He absorbed our father's worldview like gospel. When he graduated high school, my father paid for his business degree without blinking. When Andrew decided he wanted to get into real estate, my father connected him with every contractor, lender, and developer he knew. When I said I wanted to go into healthcare, my father didn't even look up from his newspaper. "Don't waste money," he said. "You'll settle down eventually." So I figured it out myself. Scholarships. Double shifts at a diner. Exhausting nights studying after work. I paid my own way, and I never asked him for help again. 8 years before everything collapsed, I remember my mother pulling me aside after another dinner, when my father praised Andrew's first big sale while barely acknowledging my acceptance letter. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "I've taken care of you. You won't understand now, but I have." I didn't know what she meant. I thought it was just something mothers say when they feel guilty. I had no idea she'd spent that afternoon in an office in Hartford, sitting across from a lawyer named Susan Reed, signing papers that would change everything. 2 years later, my mother was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. I still remember the call. I was halfway through a night shift at a senior living facility when my phone buzzed with my father's number. He never called me at work. He barely called me at all. "Your mother's sick," he said. "You need to come home." Not we need you, just you need to come home. Like it was an obligation. Like it had always been. I moved back within a week. I rearranged my schedule, took night shifts so I could be with her during the day. Chemotherapy appointments, radiation sessions, the slow, brutal erosion that cancer brings. My paycheck dropped, my sleep disappeared, but none of that mattered. This was my mother. Andrew visited 3 times in 2 years. Each visit lasted less than an hour. He'd show up in tailored suits, kiss her forehead, glance at his watch, and leave. His wife, Claire, came once. She spent most of the time taking photos of the house and barely looked at my mother. My father never acknowledged what I was doing. In his mind, this was simply expected. This was what someone like me was for. But my mother noticed. She always did. Once a month, she asked me to drive her to an office downtown. She said it was insurance paperwork. I waited in the car every time. When she came back out, she looked lighter, calmer, like she'd set something down she'd been carrying for years. One night, as I helped her into bed, she held my hand and said, "Whatever happens, remember this. You showed up. That matters more than anyone will ever admit." I thought she was talking about the illness. She wasn't. Let me tell you about my brother and his wife. Andrew and Claire lived in a 5-bedroom house in an upscale neighborhood where everything looked expensive and untouchable. Claire called herself a lifestyle curator, which meant she posted photos of designer bags and charity galas online. She looked at me like I was part of the furniture. At Thanksgiving, the last one, my mother was strong enough to cook. Claire smiled thinly and said, "Have you ever thought about doing something more ambitious? You can't take care of sick people forever." My mother's hand tightened on her fork. I told her calmly that I was helping people. Claire laughed softly, dismissively, and changed the subject. Later that night, I went to the kitchen for water and heard them talking in the hallway. "Don't worry about him," Andrew said. "Dad promised me everything years ago. He's just here to play caretaker until it's over." Claire whispered back, "We need this. We really need this." I stood there frozen, glass in my hand, realizing something didn't add up. The desperation in her voice didn't match the lifestyle they showed the world. 6 weeks ago, my mother was declared cancer-free. I cried in the doctor's office. 2 years of fear, and she had survived. We went out to lunch, and she ordered champagne for the first time since her diagnosis. She said she wanted to visit her own mother. My father finally agreed to drive. They never came back. A truck drifted across lanes on the interstate. The police said it was instant. They always say that. I was working the night shift when I got the call. I remember sitting on a concrete stairwell because I couldn't breathe, the phone on the floor beside me, the officer asking if I was alone. I don't remember driving home. I remember the smell of lavender when I pulled into the driveway at 3 in the morning, and realizing my mother would never tend it again. The funeral was 4 days later. Andrew gave the eulogy. He talked about our father for 7 minutes. He mentioned our mother twice. Before the flowers wilted, he pulled me aside and told me I no longer had a home. We stood beneath stained glass, colors cutting across his face as he said the house was his now. And that was the moment everything he believed began to fall apart. When Andrew said it, he said it like it was already settled. "We haven't even read the will yet," I told him. He smiled and straightened his tie. I noticed the brand without meaning to. Back then, I still noticed things like that. "The will is just a formality," he said. "You know how Dad felt. Sons inherit. That's how it's always been." Then he added, "You should be grateful I'm giving you a week." Grateful. The words stuck in my throat. He softened his voice, the way he always did when he wanted to sound reasonable to outsiders. "Look, I understand this is hard. You've been living there, taking care of things, but that was your choice. You could have had a real career, a real life. Instead, you chose to play caretaker. That's not my fault. Behind him, his wife was already scrolling on her phone, bored. That's not true, I said. I took care of Mum for 2 years. His eyes hardened. While I built something, while I made something of myself. Don't pretend cleaning up after sick people is the same as running a business. He stepped back, adjusting his cuffs. 1 week, he said. Then I'm changing the locks. I watched them walk away without saying goodbye to anyone. That was Monday. He didn't wait a week. Wednesday evening, 2 days after the funeral, I came home from work just after 7. I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the shift. Grief does that. It makes every step feel heavy, like you're moving through water. My key didn't work. I tried again, confused, thinking maybe the cold had warped the lock. Then I noticed the deadbolt. It had been changed too. I walked around to the garage. My clothes, my books, old case notes from school, my mother's recipe box she'd given me years earlier. Everything I owned was shoved into cardboard boxes and stacked against the wall. Rain from earlier had soaked through 2 of them. My diploma was bent and wet. Through the living room window, I saw his wife walking past with a glass of wine, laughing at something on her phone. She saw me standing there. She smiled, raised her glass slightly and turned away. I called my brother. He answered on the second ring. The house is legally mine, he said immediately. I had my lawyer confirm it. Dad's estate, Dad's house, Dad's decision. You've got 24 hours to get your stuff off the property before I have it removed. I grew up here, I said. And now you don't live here, he replied. That's how life works. Maybe if you'd made something of yourself, you wouldn't be standing in the rain. I ended the call because I didn't trust myself to speak. I sat down on the wet grass beside the boxes and pulled out the one thing that hadn't been damaged. My mother's old watch. They'd returned it to me at the hospital after she'd passed. I'd kept it in my pocket ever since. That's when I found the letter. It was tucked into a box of her things he must have thought were worthless. Gardening gloves, old photographs, and a cream-colored envelope with my name written in her handwriting. I didn't open it there. I couldn't. Instead, I called the only person I trusted, a nurse I worked with, a woman who'd quietly looked out for me for years. She arrived within half an hour, told me to get in the car, didn't ask questions. Her apartment was small but warm. When she handed me a blanket and a cup of tea, I finally broke down. Later, when I could breathe again, I opened the letter. Her handwriting shook. I could tell she'd written it during treatment, when her hands wouldn't stay still. She told me she'd seen everything, that she knew exactly who my father and brother were, that she couldn't change them, but she could protect me. She told me to contact her attorney. She told me I wasn't a burden, that I never had been, that I was the best thing she ever did. I read it 3 times before it fully sank in. The next morning, I went to the law office downtown. Old building, quiet halls, hardwood floors that creaked with every step. I felt out of place in my work clothes. The attorney greeted me like she'd been expecting me for years. She told me my mother had planned carefully, for nearly a decade. She told me everything I thought was inevitable wasn't as settled as my brother believed. Then she leaned forward and said something I've never forgotten. Whatever he says, whatever he threatens, don't react. Don't sign anything, just wait. 3 days before the will reading, my brother called. He sounded friendly. Almost kind, he told me he wanted to make things right. He offered me $10,000 if I signed away my right to contest anything. $10,000 for a lifetime of being treated like I didn't matter. I said no. His voice changed instantly. Cold. Sharp. He told me I'd walk out of the will reading with nothing. I told him I'd take that risk, and then I waited. The will reading was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. When we sat down at that long table, my brother was confident, smiling. That smile vanished when my grandmother walked in and took the seat beside me. And that was the moment I knew something he didn't. Something my mother had made sure of. Evelyn didn't react at all. She just looked at him and said calmly, "Not everything as it turns out." I felt my mother's hand close around mine beneath the table. Even now, years later, I can still feel that squeeze. My brother adjusted his watch, that smooth, practiced motion he'd learned to use when he was nervous, but didn't want anyone to know. "Fine," he said. "Let's get this over with. Read Dad's will first." Evelyn opened the first folder, Last Will and Testament of Richard Hale. She said, her voice steady. Dated 14 months prior, witnessed and notarized in Hartford County. The room went quiet in that heavy way it does when everyone thinks the outcome is already decided. And it was. At least, it was exactly what my brother expected. She read through the formal language. Executors. Debts. Funeral instructions. Then she reached the part that mattered. To my son Daniel Hale, I leave 70% of my personal assets, including my vehicle, my workshop equipment, and my share of all financial accounts held jointly with my wife. Daniel nodded slowly, satisfaction spreading across his face. To my daughter, Anna Hale, I leave 30% of my remaining personal assets. 30% of what's left, his wife murmured under her breath. After debts. I opened my mouth, but Daniel waved me off. "It's fine," he said generously. "Dad's accounts totaled about 80,000. You'll get something. Maybe 24 grand when it's all settled." He smiled at me like he was being charitable. "That's more than I expected him to leave you." My mother cleared her throat softly.
"Daniel?"
"Come on," he said, leaning back. What's left to say? The house was Dad's. The money was Dad's. I'm the primary heir. She gets a consolation prize. His wife had already pulled out her phone. "Actually," Evelyn said, cutting through the moment, "there's quite a bit left to discuss." Daniel's confidence flickered. "What do you mean?" She closed the first folder and opened the second. "Your mother's estate is separate," she said, "and significantly larger." The room went very still. "That's not possible," Daniel said. Mum didn't have her own estate. She was a housewife. Everything she had came from Dad. "That's incorrect," Evelyn replied calmly. Daniel stood up, like height alone might restore control. "Whatever this is, it doesn't change anything. Dad made his wishes clear for decades. Sons inherit. Daughters take what they're given." He turned toward Anna, and the cruelty came back. "This is what I was trying to spare you. This embarrassment." My mother spoke then, low and firm. "Daniel." He ignored her. "You really thought she left you something? What, her jewelry? Her recipes? It doesn't matter. You're still the same person you've always been." "Mr. Hale," Evelyn said sharply. Evelyn said sharply. "Sit down." The command caught him off guard. He actually listened. "This is a legal proceeding," she continued, "not a family argument. If you interrupt again, you'll receive the remainder in writing. She opened the folder. Now we address Linda Hale's will. I remember doubting everything in that moment, wondering if my brother was right. If this was just my mother trying to soften a blow she knew was coming. I looked down at the watch on my wrist, her watch, worn leather strap. Scratched face, she could have afforded better. I knew that now. Evelyn began reading. Last Will and Testament of Linda Eleanor Hale. She read my mother's letter aloud. Every word, every truth my brother had never wanted to hear. How she'd watched favoritism play out for decades. How she'd seen Anna work twice as hard for half the recognition. How she had seen her come home and care for her when no one else would. My brother's face drained of color. When Evelyn finished, the room was silent. Then she slid a document across the table. The house, she said. Daniel straightened. That was Dad's. It wasn't, she replied. 5 years ago, your parents transferred the deed into Linda's name alone. What? He grabbed the paper, scanning it wildly. For liability protection, Evelyn explained. Your father was facing a lawsuit. The transfer was never reversed. The house, the one he threw her out of, it had been hers all along. And there's the trust, Evelyn continued. Daniel looked stunned. What trust? An irrevocable trust, she said. Established 8 years ago. Sole beneficiary. Anna. My mother lifted her chin. I gave my daughter the money. What she did with it was her choice. The trust had grown to over $1 million. My brother couldn't speak. There's also a life insurance policy, Evelyn said. $500,000. Beneficiary, Anna Hale. Daniel finally broke. I'm her son, he said. She can't leave me nothing. She didn't, Evelyn replied. She left you her personal effects. And a letter. Daniel laughed bitterly. A letter? You visited her 3 times, Anna said quietly. 3 times in 2 years. He had no answer. When he finally stood and shouted that he would contest everything, Evelyn didn't flinch. She just tapped the USB drive on the table. Your mother anticipated that, she said, and she made sure it would fail. That was the moment my brother realized the story he'd been telling himself his whole life was over. And that was the moment my mother finally had the last word. When I think back to that day now, at 56, sitting in my office with cold coffee and old case files stacked around me, I can still see it like it's happening in slow motion. Back then, I was young, exhausted, and had no idea how close everything was to breaking apart. Daniel's jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth might crack. The lawyer, a calm woman named Eleanor Price, didn't flinch. She just kept going, voice steady, like she'd done this 100 times before. She explained that the irrevocable trust and the life insurance beneficiary designations couldn't be challenged. They weren't part of the will. They never touched probate. They existed on their own, sealed tight years earlier. Daniel had no legal standing to contest them. There has to be something, he said, almost pleading. If you want to contest your father's will, you can, Eleanor replied evenly. But I strongly suggest you speak with your own attorney about the costs compared to what you might recover. As for your mother's arrangements, she paused and looked straight at him. She spent 8 years making sure everything was airtight. That's when my grandmother spoke up. Her voice was soft, but it carried weight. My daughter didn't do this to punish you, Daniel. She did it because she knew. We all you. Without protection, Claire would have been left with nothing, and she deserved better than nothing. Daniel turned on her, face twisted with rage. You helped her hide this. You helped her cut me out. I helped her protect her child, Grandma said simply. That's what any mother would do. He had no answer for that. His wife, Rebecca, was the next to break. She shot up from her chair, her perfect composure finally cracking. This is insane, she snapped. She's a nurse. She cleans up after sick people for a living. And she gets $2 million while While you what, Mrs. Hale? Eleanor asked calmly. Rebecca stopped. She knew she'd gone too far. That's when Grandma delivered the blow none of them saw coming. You're about to lose the house in Westfield, she said quietly. Did you think we didn't know about Daniel's failed investments? The $400,000 he lost? The foreclosure notices? Daniel's face drained of color. How would you know that? Grandma didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She talked about the debts, the bad deals, the desperation. She said she knew Daniel had been counting on the inheritance to save him. That was exactly why my mother made sure he couldn't touch what she'd built for me. I remember looking at my brother then, really looking. The expensive watch, the tailored suit, the luxury car outside. All of it was a shell, a fragile structure built on credit, and the belief that our parents' money would always be there to catch him. You were planning to take everything, I said slowly. Not because you needed it, but because you were drowning. I'm not drowning, he snapped. I had a setback. A temporary setback Dad's estate would have fixed. I finished. Except the estate wasn't what you thought it was. Rebecca sank back into her chair, mascara starting to run. I told Daniel he'd spent his whole life being told he deserved everything, and he'd never stopped to question it. He didn't respond. He couldn't. I want to pause here for a moment. I know some of you listening are wondering why Rebecca said what she did, why she exposed their situation in front of everyone. Fear does that. When the thing you've been counting on vanishes, survival takes over. Pride disappears. Masks fall. Eleanor waited for the room to settle before speaking again. She summarized the assets transferring to me. The house on Maple Lane valued at $650,000. The trust created years earlier, $1.2 million. The life insurance policy, $500,000. And from my father's estate, a small percentage of remaining liquid assets. The total came to just under $2.4 million. The number hung in the air. My mother, who wore the same simple watch for years and grew vegetables in the backyard, had quietly left me a future. Daniel made a strange noise and gripped the table. He tried to stand, then collapsed. His head hit the edge of the desk on the way down. Rebecca screamed. Someone called. Emergency services. I sat there frozen, watching my brother unconscious on the carpet, taken down by numbers on a page. They said it was a fainting episode caused by shock. Nothing life-threatening. 20 minutes later, he was back in his chair, pale and shaking. You knew, he said hoarsely. You knew all of this.
I didn't, I told him.
And it was true. I only knew Mum loved me. He laughed, bitter and broken. She didn't love me. She loved who you could have been, I said, but she saw who you chose to become. He asked for help, said we were family. I reminded him how he'd thrown me out of the house days after our mother died, how he'd called me a burden, how he'd tried to buy me off for a few $1,000s. I wasn't cruel, but I wasn't going to rescue him from choices he made while treating me like I was worthless. When I walked out, Grandma stopped me in the hall and handed me a small velvet box. Inside was my mother's ring. She told me it was meant to be mine. Then she told me something else. My mother had wanted to leave my father years before, but she stayed for the children. The trust, the insurance, all of it was her way of giving me freedom. Months later, I sat with a financial advisor who told me to keep living my life, pay off debts, keep working, let money give options, not change who I was. Daniel lost the house. His marriage fell apart. I didn't feel triumph, just distance. When I finally returned to the house, the lavender garden was still alive, new shoots pushing through the soil, proof that some things survive no matter what. Now, decades later, as a detective who's seen greed, desperation, and regret ruin lives, I understand what my mother really left me. Not money, perspective, the strength to walk away from people who don't value you, and the clarity to see truth, even when it hurts. I followed the plan exactly the advisor laid out for me. I used money from the trust only for tuition and books, just enough to get through school, and I left the rest alone, growing quietly in the background where I couldn't see it or be tempted by it. I kept working part-time at Maplewood, because I wasn't ready to leave the patients I'd grown attached to. Even now, at 56, after years on the force and more cases than I can count, I can tell you that kind of work stays with you. When people trust you at their weakest, it changes you. Diane and I found a small apartment near the hospital. 2 bedrooms, nothing fancy, a tiny balcony that barely caught the sun. I started growing lavender in old pots out there. Diane joked that living alone was overrated anyway. I said having a roommate meant splitting rent and streaming subscriptions. We both knew it wasn't really about that. It was about not being alone while we figured out who we were becoming. Grandma called every Sunday. Without fail, she told me stories about my mother as a child, about road trips and small rebellions, about who she was before marriage and responsibility wore her down. I recorded those calls, all of them. Built a small archive of a woman I thought I knew but was still discovering. Those recordings got me through more than one hard night later in life. I rented the house on Maple Drive to a young family. The woman was a nurse, like I'd been, and her husband worked construction. They had 2 little girls. The older one asked if she could take care of the lavender garden. I said yes without hesitation. I said yes to a lot of things that year. To opportunities, to rest, to the slow realization that I was worth more than I'd been taught to believe. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't back then. My mother didn't give me money. She gave me permission. Permission to believe I deserved a full life. Over the years, I've thought a lot about my brother. Not to excuse him. There's no excuse for how he treated me. But understanding people is part of what made me a good detective. He grew up being told he was special, simply because of who he was. He didn't have to prove himself. The world opened doors for him before he even knocked. So he never built the muscles the rest of us had to build. Empathy. Accountability. The ability to accept that other people's needs mattered just as much as his own. They call it entitlement now. The belief that you deserve things without earning them. It isn't something you're born with, it's taught. And once it takes root, it's almost impossible to pull out. Because admitting you're not special means admitting your entire identity was built on a lie. My brother wasn't a monster. He was a product of a system that told him he was worth more than everyone else. And when reality finally showed up with receipts, he didn't know how to survive it. I don't know if he ever changed. I hope he did. But I learned something critical early on. His growth was never my responsibility. My responsibility was to myself, to live the life my mother wanted for me, to set boundaries that protected my peace, to understand that walking away from people who harm you isn't cruelty, it's survival. After decades in law enforcement, after seeing what bitterness and entitlement do to people, that lesson has only deepened. If you're listening to this, and you've spent years being told you weren't enough by family, by partners, by anyone who should have loved you, I want you to hear this clearly. They were wrong. You were always enough. Sometimes the people who love us protect us in ways we don't recognize until much later. And sometimes, when they're gone, we have to learn how to protect ourselves. That's what my mother taught me, even after she was gone. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who protected you, or someone you wish had, hold on to that feeling. Those connections matter more than money ever will. Thank you for listening all the way through. At my age, you learn not to take that kind of attention lightly. It means more than you might think.